The 1971 Plymouth HEMI Cuda, Detroit's wildest muscle monster. Part 1. The Legend Awakens. The street is quiet, too quiet, until a deep, violent rumble cuts through the stillness. Out of the shadows rolls a 1971 Plymouth HEMI Cuda, its dual headlights glowing like a predator stalking the night. This isn't the sound of a normal engine. This is the distinctive, unmistakable growl of 426 cubic inches of pure American muscle, a sound that hasn't been heard on streets like this in decades. It's the kind of noise that stops conversations mid-sentence, that makes people turn their heads with a mixture of reverence and primal recognition. High-impact colors splash across its aggressive body. The shaker hood trembles with raw fury, feeding a beast that barely fits under the sheet metal. The lines are sharp, muscular, unapologetically American. Every curve speaks of intent, every angle screams aggression. This isn't a car designed by committee or focus groups. This is a machine born from pure automotive passion, a time when engineers weren't constrained by fuel economy standards or emissions regulations. The Cuda's bodywork tells the story of an era when manufacturers asked not, "Should we?" but simply, "How powerful can we make it?" The paint itself is a statement, whether it's panther pink, plum crazy purple, or the equally outrageous sublime green. The color choice was never about blending in. Owners of these machines understood that if you were bold enough to own a HEMI Cuda, you were bold enough to park it in the brightest color imaginable. It was armor for the rebellion, a visual declaration that this car represented something different, something dangerous, something that refused to play by the rules of polite society. Older gearheads freeze for a moment, letting their memories catch up. Their eyes narrow as they calculate the year, the engine, the rarity. The 71 HEMI Cuda wasn't just a car, it was the last great roar of an untamed muscle era. Rare, loud, rebellious, a legend born from gasoline and grit. These weren't cars made in massive numbers. These were weapons, forged in the final days of the muscle car era, crafted for those who understood that automotive passion could never be mass-produced or diluted by bean counters and marketing departments. Vrucht. Part 2. The Heritage of Mopar Madness. To understand the 1971 Plymouth HEMI Cuda, you have to understand the culture that created it. The 1960s and early 1970s were the golden age of American muscle cars, a time when Detroit didn't just compete, it absolutely dominated. The rivalry between manufacturers wasn't about fuel efficiency or reliability. It was about raw horsepower, about who could squeeze the most power from an engine block, about creating machines that could tear down a quarter-mile faster than anyone else. Plymouth, Dodge, and Chrysler formed the Mopar Trinity, a trio of manufacturers that became synonymous with unbridled power and unconventional design. While Ford had the Mustang and Chevrolet had the Camaro, Chrysler had something equally legendary but arguably more aggressive, the Plymouth Barracuda. The Cuda, as it was affectionately known, was Plymouth's answer to the pony car wars, but it was never designed to be a gentle compromise vehicle. From its inception in 1964, the Barracuda was built with the understanding that it should be a muscle car first and a practical vehicle somewhere down the line. The 1971 model year represented the culmination of this philosophy. By 1971, the muscle car era was already beginning to wind down. Insurance companies had realized what these machines represented and begun charging astronomical premiums. Federal regulations were tightening, and the energy crisis loomed on the horizon. Manufacturers knew that the days of unbridled, unchecked horsepower were numbered. They had maybe one more year, possibly two, before the regulations would make machines like the HEMI Cuda obsolete. In response, Plymouth didn't dial things back. They doubled down. They took the already aggressive Cuda design and paired it with their most fearsome engine, the legendary 426 HEMI. This wasn't a compromise engine or a mid-range option. The 426 HEMI was Chrysler's ultimate expression of raw power, a hemispherical combustion chamber design that allowed for massive valve sizes and incredible flow rates. It was an engine designed for racing, an engine that had dominated the drag strips and the oval tracks. The 426 HEMI produced an official rating of 425 horsepower and 490 foot-pounds of torque. But seasoned gearheads knew that the real numbers were substantially higher. The factory had begun underrating horsepower to avoid insurance premiums and regulatory scrutiny. Estimates suggest that the 71 HEMI Cuda was producing somewhere between 450 and 475 actual horsepower with torque figures that could exceed 500 foot-pounds. In a car that weighed less than 3,500 pounds, this created a power-to-weight ratio that rivaled contemporary supercars. But here's what made the 1971 HEMI Cuda truly special. It was the last of its kind. Plymouth's E-body platform, which housed both the Barracuda and the Dodge Challenger, was about to be redesigned. The next generation would be larger, heavier, and ultimately less nimble. The 426 HEMI, meanwhile, was about to be withdrawn from regular production. The combination of the final year of the E-body and the last opportunity to order a 426 HEMI in a production car meant that the 1971 HEMI Cuda represented the absolute pinnacle of an era. Production numbers tell the story. For the entire 1971 model year, Plymouth produced only 17 HEMI Cudas. Some sources suggest the number might be slightly higher when accounting for vehicles that were ordered but registered in subsequent years. But the consensus is that somewhere between 15 and 20 examples were built. When you compare this to the hundreds of thousands of standard Barracudas and Challengers produced in the same year, the exclusivity becomes almost mythical. These weren't cars made for the masses. These were halo vehicles, the absolute expression of what was possible when engineering met unbridled ambition. Part 3. The Engineering Beast. Underneath the aggressive bodywork, the 1971 HEMI Cuda was an engineering marvel, not in spite of its limitations, but because of them. This was an era before computer optimization, before fuel injection, before all the technological crutches that modern cars rely upon. Everything about the HEMI was mechanical, tangible, and required the driver to understand the machine. The 426 HEMI itself was a marvel of mid-century engineering. The hemispherical chamber design had been around for decades, but Chrysler's implementation was revolutionary. The large hemispherical combustion chamber meant that the intake and exhaust valves could be positioned at an angle relative to each other, allowing them to be significantly larger than a conventional wedge engine. The HEMI's intake valves measured nearly 2 inches in diameter, while the exhaust valves approached that size as well. This massive valve area allowed for exceptional airflow in and out of the cylinders. In the 1971 HEMI Cuda, this theoretical advantage was translated into real-world performance through a dual 4-barrel carburetor setup mounted on an Edelbrock intake manifold. The dual quads delivered approximately 150 cubic feet per minute of air at peak engine speed, ensuring that the HEMI would never be starved for fuel or air, even under maximum throttle. The carburetor synchronization and jetting had to be absolutely perfect. A slight misadjustment could mean the difference between a smooth, powerful engine and one that bucked and hesitated. The ignition system was equally critical. The 426 HEMI relied on a mechanical distributor with a points-based ignition system. There was no electronic control module monitoring everything, no computer adjusting spark advance on the fly. Instead, a sophisticated mechanical centrifugal advance system and a vacuum advance mechanism worked together to adjust spark timing based on engine speed and load. It required skill and understanding to maintain properly, but when dialed in correctly, it would reward the driver with explosive power. The transmission options were equally uncompromising. The standard 1971 HEMI Cuda came with either a 3-speed TorqueFlite automatic or the legendary 4-speed manual. The manual transmission option was a close-ratio Chrysler 4-speed, specifically selected for its ability to handle the HEMI's massive torque output. The gear ratios were tight, designed for drag strip performance rather than highway cruising. First gear would launch the Cuda to nearly 60 miles per hour before the driver would need to upshift to second. This wasn't a car for leisurely Sunday drives or fuel economy. The suspension was somewhat pedestrian by modern standards, but for 1971 it was adequate for the task at hand. Independent front suspension with torsion bars and a live rear axle with leaf springs kept the HEMI Cuda planted to the ground. The suspension geometry had been refined over the years to minimize lift during acceleration and maintain stability under heavy braking. The brakes themselves were power-assisted disc brakes in front with drum brakes in the rear, adequate for the era, though anything near the car's maximum performance would require serious driver skill and extreme confidence. The cooling system had to be engineered to cope with an engine that could easily exceed 6,500 RPM and generate massive amounts of heat. A heavy-duty radiator, mechanical cooling fan, and careful routing of coolant passages ensured that the HEMI would stay within operating temperature during intense driving. Owners who pushed their cars hard learned to keep an eye on the temperature gauge and respect the machine's thermal limitations. Part 4. The Cockpit Experience. Slide into the vinyl bucket seat and the world shrinks to a pistol grip shifter, a simple gauge cluster, and that unmistakable smell of old Detroit steel. The interior of a 1971 HEMI Cuda wasn't about luxury or comfort. It was about function, about creating an environment where the driver could feel completely connected to the machine and understand exactly what was happening at any given moment. The steering wheel was a practical three-spoke design, smaller in diameter than modern wheels, roughly 14.5 inches, which meant that significant effort was required to maneuver the car at low speeds. There was no power steering assist in the 71 HEMI Cuda. The driver received direct immediate feedback from the front tires, feeling every bump in the road, every weight transfer during cornering. This wasn't a shortcoming, it was a feature. The driver always knew exactly what the front end was doing, whether the car was pushing toward understeer or beginning to drift into a corner. The dashboard was refreshingly simple. A large speedometer dominated the central instrument cluster, with secondary gauges arranged around it: oil pressure, temperature, fuel level, and amperage. There was no tachometer in early base models, though high-performance Cudas typically included one. The omission of a tach in some models meant that drivers had to listen to their engine, had to feel the acceleration, and understand through sound and seat-of-the-pants sensation when it was time to shift. For those with tachs, the needle would sweep across the dial with mesmerizing speed, the mechanical needle clicking rapidly as engine speed increased. The center console housed the shifter, either the automatic smooth push-button selector or the manual transmission's short, aggressive lever. The manual shifter had a distinctive short throw, allowing for lightning-quick gear changes. Experienced drivers could work the clutch and shifter with remarkable speed, though the clutch itself required significant pressure to engage and disengage. There was nothing power-assisted about it. It was a mechanical link between the driver's leg and the transmission. Turn the key. The HEMI snarls awake, shaking the cabin like a caged animal. The mechanical starter whirs briefly, and then the HEMI ignites. The initial startup is almost violent. The engine catches and immediately settles into an aggressive idle, perhaps 800 RPM, with a distinctive loping quality that's unique to large displacement engines. The cabin vibrates as the engine settles in, and the driver becomes immediately aware of the raw power residing under the hood. The smell inside the car immediately tells you this isn't a modern vehicle. There's the acrid scent of gasoline from the carburetors, the hot metal smell of the engine bay, a hint of aged vinyl and plastic. The windows are manual crank units, no electric motors here. The air conditioning, if equipped, operates a mechanical compressor that draws power directly from the engine, providing cool but not particularly efficient climate control. Everything about the environment reinforces the reality of what this machine is: a product of an era before computers, before electronic assists, before the distance that exists between modern drivers and their machines. The driving experience itself is immediate and intense. Gently bringing the RPMs up reveals the raw nature of the beast. At 2,000 RPM, the engine sounds almost civilized, a low rumble that seems to be constantly on the verge of breaking loose. Pushed to 3,000 RPM and the pitch rises, the aggression becomes more apparent. At 4,000 RPM, the HEMI is singing, a cacophony of mechanical noise as the intake manifold roars, the exhaust pops and crackles, and the whole car seems ready to explode. The throttle response is immediate and total, There's no fuel injection computer calculating how much fuel to deliver, no transmission control unit deciding which gear to select. Input the throttle, and the carburetors respond instantly. Flex the accelerator, and the V8 lunges forward with an authority that's almost frightening. The G-forces push the driver back into the seat, and the front end momentarily lightens as the weight of the car shifts rearward. Part 5. The performance reality numbers on a specification sheet don't convey the real-world experience of a 1971 HEMI Cuda. The official 425 horsepower and 490 foot-pounds of torque represent what Chrysler was willing to claim publicly, but serious enthusiasts knew the actual numbers were considerably higher. Contemporary testing suggested the real output was closer to 450 to 475 horsepower, with torque exceeding 500 foot-pounds. In a car weighing roughly 3,400 pounds, this created extraordinary performance. The quarter mile, the standard measure of straight-line performance in the muscle car era, was where the HEMI Cuda truly showed its capabilities. Contemporary tests by magazines like Motor Trend and Car and Driver showed the 1971 HEMI Cuda capable of running quarter-mile times in the low 13-second range at speeds exceeding 105 miles per hour. From a standstill, the car would accelerate to 60 miles per hour in the mid to high 5-second range, with some test drivers claiming times as low as 5.3 seconds. But performance wasn't always consistent. The mechanical nature of the car meant that everything had to be absolutely perfect to extract maximum performance. The engine had to be perfectly tuned, the carburetor synchronization had to be exact, the ignition timing had to be precisely set. A slight misadjustment in any of these areas would cost tenths of a second in the quarter mile. This is why serious HEMI Cuda owners often employed specialized mechanics who understood the intricate tuning requirements of these engines. The handling characteristics of the 1971 Cuda were surprisingly competent for the era. The E-body platform, while not as refined as some European sports cars, had been through several generations of development by 1971. The independent front suspension kept the front end planted, and the leaf spring rear axle, while prone to axle tramp under extreme acceleration, was manageable for experienced drivers. The brakes, while not up to modern standards, were adequate for careful drivers who understood their limitations. But the HEMI Cuda's true performance advantage lay in straight-line acceleration. This was a machine engineered for the quarter-mile drag strip, and that's where it excelled. On tight road courses or winding mountain roads, the car's weight distribution, it was decidedly front-heavy due to the massive engine. The manual steering and the brake limitations meant it wasn't necessarily superior to lighter, more balanced sports cars. But given a straight line and traction, the HEMI Cuda would leave almost everything of the era in its dust. Part 6. The final gasp of an era. The 1971 model year represented a crucial inflection point in the muscle car era. The writing was already on the wall. Insurance companies had recognized that these ultra-high-performance machines represented significant liability, and insurance premiums for a young driver buying a HEMI Cuda had climbed into stratospheric territory. What once might have cost $35 per month for a standard performance car might now cost $150 to $200 monthly for a HEMI-equipped machine. The federal government, too, was beginning to assert itself. The Clean Air Act had begun implementing emission standards, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was establishing safety requirements. Engine horsepower would soon be capped through voluntary manufacturer agreements. By 1974, the muscle car era would effectively be finished. Manufacturers would continue to build fast cars, but never again would they receive official factory support for the unbridled pursuit of raw power without compromise. But in 1971, the manufacturers knew they had one last chance. This was the final opportunity to offer maximum displacement, maximum power, and minimum restraint. It was as if Detroit understood that this era was ending and wanted to produce one final statement before the regulators closed the door forever. The 1971 HEMI Cuda was that statement, a machine built without apology, without compromise, expressing the pure automotive ambition of an era. The HEMI Cuda's rarity was partly intentional. Plymouth knew that the era was ending. They didn't want to overproduce a machine that might not be legal to sell in a year or two. They wanted the HEMI Cuda to be special, exclusive, the ultimate expression of what was possible. By limiting production to just 17 vehicles, or perhaps slightly more, they ensured that every HEMI Cuda produced would become a collector's item and a piece of automotive history. Part 7. The Legacy and the Myth. Today, nearly 55 years after its introduction, the 1971 HEMI Cuda occupies a unique place in automotive history. It exists at the convergence of multiple factors: the final year of the e-body platform, the last opportunity to order a 426 HEMI in a production car, the twilight of the muscle car era, and an era before computers made cars mysterious and opaque to their owners. This convergence of circumstances has elevated the 1971 HEMI Cuda from a fast car to a legend, from a vehicle to a symbol. The car represents not just engineering excellence, but a moment in time. It stands for an era when automotive ambition wasn't constrained by bean counters and focus groups. It represents a time when a manufacturer could ask, "What if we built the fastest, most powerful, most aggressive car possible?" and then actually do it. The 1971 HEMI Cuda answered that question in the most emphatic way possible. Original examples of the 1971 HEMI Cuda are now worth substantial sums. A well-preserved example in original condition might command anywhere from $400,000 to over $1,000 at auction, depending on specific color, options, and condition. Restored examples might sell for slightly less, though a particularly fine restoration could rival original examples in value. The 17 or so examples produced have become some of the most sought-after American muscle cars in existence, competing for collector attention with the rarest Chevrolet L88 Corvettes and the most exclusive Dodge and Plymouth muscle cars. But the real value of the 1971 HEMI Cuda transcends monetary worth. These cars represent the final expression of an era, a moment when American automotive manufacturers believed that more power was always better, that bigger displacement was the path to glory, that customer desires for extreme performance superseded concerns about practicality or efficiency. In our current era of forced induction, electric vehicles, and computer-controlled everything, the 1971 HEMI Cuda stands as a monument to a different philosophy, a different approach to automotive design and engineering. Part 8. The theme of pure power. The 71 HEMI Cuda represents the final stand of pure, untamed American horsepower. No restraint, no compromise, just raw power engineered for the brave and remembered by the faithful. In an era obsessed with emissions control, safety regulations, and efficiency standards, it's easy to forget that muscle cars like the HEMI Cuda were never designed with these concerns in mind. They were designed for one purpose: to go as fast as possible in a straight line. This singular purpose gave the HEMI Cuda a clarity of vision that modern cars, for all their technological sophistication, often lack. Every design decision supported the core mission. The engine was as large as the manufacturer could make it. The body was as light as possible. The suspension was tuned for drag strip performance rather than road course handling. The interior was stripped down to essentials. Nothing was added that didn't serve the primary mission of straight-line acceleration. There's a purity in this approach that resonates with enthusiasts even decades later. The HEMI Cuda doesn't ask for approval or apology. It doesn't apologize for its size, its thirst for fuel, its high emissions, its demanding maintenance requirements. It simply presents itself as a machine designed for a specific purpose and executes that purpose with uncompromising intensity. Conclusion: the Holy Grail. The 1971 Plymouth HEMI Cuda isn't just a classic, it's the Holy Grail of Mopar mythology, a symbol of when Detroit built legends with thunder in their veins and rebellion in their soul. It represents a moment when a manufacturer could still produce vehicles without compromise, when the driving experience could be immediate and unfiltered, when raw horsepower and aggressive styling could combine to create something genuinely special. Every HEMI Cuda that still exists today is a precious artifact, a tangible connection to an era when the American automotive industry pursued performance with singularity of purpose. When you see one, actually see one, parked at a car show, or, if you're incredibly fortunate, rolling down the street with that unmistakable engine note, you're witnessing not just a car, but a time capsule, a mechanical memory of what automotive passion looked like in 1971. The machine that emerges from the shadows with that deep, violent rumble isn't just a car. It's the last roar of an untamed era, a mechanical statement that will never be repeated. In the Museum of American Automotive History, the 1971 HEMI Cuda occupies a place reserved for only the most important, most significant, most legendary machines. It is a masterpiece of muscle car philosophy, a final gasping statement made at the exact moment when the era was ending, a machine that perfectly embodied the dreams and ambitions of everyone who loved raw power and beautiful noise.